Eleanor Walsh's trembling finger hovered over the 911 button as her dog Bruno stood protectively between her and the shattered glass door, his massive frame blocking the intruder who now lay unconscious on her kitchen floor. The emergency dispatcher's voice crackled through the phone speaker, but Eleanor's response made the woman pause mid-sentence. "Ma'am, did you just say your dog is 6 feet tall and weighs 400 pounds? The question hung in the air like a loaded gun. Through her neighbor's window across the street, Margaret Chen dropped her morning coffee mug, the ceramic exploding against her hardwood floor as she stared in disbelief. Eleanor's voice caught in her throat as she looked down at Bruno's intelligent brown eyes, eyes that had watched over her for 8 months, eyes that belonged to something she'd convinced herself was just an unusually large German Shepherd mix. "Send someone immediately," Eleanor whispered, her weathered hands still shaking as the reality crashed over her like a cold wave. What exactly had she been sharing her bed with all these months? And why did the thought of losing him terrify her more than facing the truth? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 6 months earlier, Eleanor Walsh had been living the kind of quiet desperation that settles over widows like dust on forgotten furniture. At 68, she moved through her modest Spokane home with the deliberate pace of someone who had nowhere urgent to be and no one waiting for her arrival. The morning routine never varied. Black coffee at the kitchen table that still bore ring stains from Harold's favorite mug, the Today Show playing to an audience of one, and 47 minutes of watching birds at the backyard feeder through windows that needed washing. The house on Maple Street had once buzzed with the chaos of 3 children, birthday parties, and Harold's booming laugh echoing from the garage where he restored classic cars. Now it held only the whispered conversations Eleanor had with herself and the occasional phone call from her children, Michael in Seattle, too busy with his law practice to visit, Jennifer in Portland, consumed by her twin toddlers, and David, the youngest at 38, who called every Sunday but lived clear across the country in Atlanta. Eleanor's retirement savings of $180,000 sat untouched in her account, a modest nest egg she'd never needed to consider spending. Her Social Security covered the basics, and Harold's pension took care of the rest. But money couldn't fill the silence that had become her constant companion since Harold's heart attack 18 months ago. Dr. Patricia Williams had been gentle but direct during Eleanor's last appointment. "Depression is common at your stage of life, Eleanor. The antidepressants might help, but you need to find something that gives you purpose again." The prescription bottle sat unopened in Eleanor's purse, another reminder of a life that felt like it was winding down rather than being lived. The neighborhood around her was changing too. Young families moved in and out with increasing frequency, their children's voices a bittersweet reminder of when her own kids had filled these sidewalks with bicycle races and chalk drawings. Mrs. Patterson next door had moved to assisted living, and the Hendersons across the street rarely acknowledged her wave anymore. Eleanor found herself checking the obituaries each morning, a habit that both comforted and terrified her. Comforted because she wasn't listed, terrified because she wondered if anyone would notice when She'd begun talking to Harold's photograph on the mantel, updating him on neighborhood gossip, and telling him about the squirrel that had outsmarted her bird feeder again. Sometimes she caught herself setting 2 plates at breakfast, muscle memory stronger than grief. The house felt too big and too small simultaneously, too big for one person, too small for the weight of loneliness that seemed to expand and fill every corner. It was this Eleanor, isolated, grieving, desperate for something to care about, who would make the split-second decision that October afternoon that would transform not just her life, but challenge everything she thought she knew about love, family, and the courage required to protect what matters most. The October afternoon sun slanted through Eleanor's windshield as she drove home from Dr. Williams' office, the unopened prescription bottle rattling in her purse with each turn. Highway 2 stretched ahead, familiar and unchanging, when something unusual caught her eye near mile marker 47. A small pet carrier sat abandoned on the gravel shoulder, barely visible among the autumn leaves scattered by passing trucks. Eleanor's first instinct was to keep driving. Getting involved in roadside situations wasn't something a 68-year-old woman should do alone. But as she passed, she heard it. A thin, desperate whimpering that cut through the rumble of her engine and straight into her heart. Without thinking, she pulled over, hazard lights blinking as semi-trucks thundered past, rocking her small sedan in their wake. The carrier was newer than she'd expected, not weathered by long exposure. Inside, curled against the back corner, was the smallest, most pitiful creature she'd ever seen. What she assumed was a German Shepherd puppy, maybe 6 weeks old, looked up at her with dark, intelligent eyes that seemed far too knowing for such a young animal. Its fur was thick and dark, almost black, with the softest texture she'd ever felt when she cautiously reached through the wire door. "Oh, sweetheart," Eleanor whispered, her voice catching. The puppy didn't cower or snap. Instead, it pressed its tiny body against her fingers as if starved for human contact. "What are you doing out here all alone?" There was no note, no explanation, just a small water dish that had long since emptied, and what looked like the remains of some kibble. Eleanor's nursing instincts kicked in as she assessed the situation. The puppy was thin but not emaciated, suggesting it hadn't been abandoned for more than a day or two. Its eyes were clear, nose cold and wet. Good signs. But it was shivering despite its thick coat, and when Eleanor opened the carrier door, it immediately crawled into her lap, seeking warmth. For the first time in 18 months, Eleanor felt something she'd forgotten existed, the overwhelming need to protect something vulnerable. This tiny creature needed her in a way that her grown children no longer did, in a way that Harold no longer could. As she sat in her car on the shoulder of Highway 2, holding this abandoned puppy against her chest, Eleanor Walsh felt purpose flooding back into her life like water into a drought-stricken garden. The drive home was careful and slow, the puppy sleeping peacefully in the passenger seat she'd made into a makeshift bed with her jacket. Eleanor found herself talking to it. Him, she decided, though she wasn't entirely sure, telling him about the house he was going to see, about Harold, who would have loved him, about how they were both going to be okay now. "I'm going to call you Bruno," she said as she pulled into her driveway. That was Harold's middle name. He always said it made him sound tougher than he was. The puppy's tail, surprisingly thick for such a young animal, gave a small wag at the sound of her voice. Eleanor's neighbor, Margaret Chen, was watering her garden when Eleanor emerged from the car carrying Bruno. At 70, Margaret had been Harold's closest friend on the street, and Eleanor had always appreciated her no-nonsense approach to life. "Eleanor Walsh, what do you have there?" Margaret called, setting down her hose and walking to the property line. "Found him abandoned on Highway 2, Eleanor replied, adjusting her hold as Bruno nestled deeper into her arms. "Couldn't just leave him there." Margaret's expression softened as she got closer. "He's beautiful. Big paws on him. He's going to be a large dog. You sure you want to take this on?" The question should have given Eleanor pause. She hadn't owned a pet since the children were young, and never a large breed. But looking down at Bruno's peaceful face, she felt more certain of this decision than she'd felt about anything in months. "I'm sure," Eleanor said firmly. "We found each other for a reason." That night, Eleanor set up a makeshift bed for Bruno in the laundry room, complete with old towels and a water dish. But when she went to check on him before bed, she found him sitting by the back door, not whimpering or scratching, just waiting patiently. Something in his demeanor, the way he looked at her, the quiet dignity of his posture, made her decision for her. "All right, Bruno," she said, opening the door that led to her bedroom. "Just for tonight." Bruno padded into the room and settled on the rug beside Harold's side of the bed. For the first time since her husband's death, Eleanor fell asleep not to the sound of her own worried thoughts, but to the gentle rhythm of another living creature's breathing. She slept 8 hours straight, the deepest sleep she'd had in over a year. The first sign that something was different came 3 weeks after Eleanor brought Bruno home. What she'd assumed was a 6-week-old puppy had grown from 8 pounds to 25 pounds, a rate that made her question her initial assessment of his age. Maybe he'd been older than she thought. Maybe German Shepherds just grew faster than she remembered from her childhood. But when she mentioned it to Margaret over their morning coffee, her neighbor's expression grew thoughtful. "Eleanor, honey, that's not normal puppy growth," Margaret said, setting down her mug. "Even for a large breed. And look at those paws. They're enormous." Bruno, now the size of a 3-month-old retriever, was demonstrating another unusual behavior. Instead of playing with the tennis balls Eleanor had bought him, he was methodically dismantling them, not in a destructive way, but with an almost scientific curiosity. His intelligence was startling. He'd learned to open the back door by turning the handle within his first week, had figured out how to turn on the kitchen faucet when his water bowl was empty, and showed an uncanny ability to understand not just commands, but Eleanor's moods and needs. The real shock came during his first veterinary appointment. Dr. Sarah Martinez had been Spokane's most respected veterinarian for 15 years. But when Eleanor brought Bruno in for his puppy shots, the doctor's confident expression shifted to confusion within minutes of the examination. "Mrs. Walsh," Dr. Martinez said carefully, "I need to ask you some questions about where you found Bruno. His bone structure, his facial features, even his coat pattern. None of this is consistent with any domestic dog breed I'm familiar with." Eleanor felt her stomach tighten. "What do you mean? He's just a large breed puppy, isn't he?" "Doctor." Martinez lifted Bruno's lip to examine his teeth, then measured his skull with calipers. "His skull is broader than any dog his age should have. His canine teeth are developing differently. And look at his claws. They're non-retractable, which is normal for dogs, but they're unusually thick and curved." She paused, clearly struggling with her assessment. "Mrs. Walsh, I think we need to run some tests." The suggestion hit Eleanor like a physical blow. In the 6 weeks since finding Bruno, he had become her entire world. He slept at the foot of her bed, followed her from room to room, and seemed to sense when she needed comfort. On the days when grief over Harold threatened to overwhelm her, Bruno would rest his increasingly large head in her lap, his presence alone enough to steady her breathing and quiet her tears. "What kind of tests?" Eleanor asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. "DNA testing, for starters." "I want to understand what we're dealing with here." Dr. Martinez's tone was gentle but firm. "Mrs. Walsh, I'm not trying to frighten you, but Bruno's growth rate and physical characteristics are raising some red flags. If he's not what we think he is, there could be legal implications." Eleanor left the veterinary office with a growing sense of dread and the appointment scheduled for the following week. But her world was about to become more complicated in ways she couldn't imagine. 2 days later, she was working in her garden when a black pickup truck pulled into her driveway. The man who emerged was tall and thin, with the kind of weathered face that suggested years of outdoor work. He wore clean jeans and a flannel shirt, but something about his demeanor immediately put Eleanor on edge. "Mrs. Walsh," he called, approaching her fence. "I'm Vincent Castellano." "I think you might have something that belongs to me." Eleanor straightened, her gardening gloves still dirty with soil. "I'm sorry. I don't know what you're talking about." Vincent's eyes scanned her yard until they landed on Bruno, who was lying in the shade of the oak tree, now nearly 40 pounds and unmistakably not a normal dog. Even at rest, his size and proportions were becoming impossible to explain away. "That animal," Vincent said, pointing at Bruno. "Where did you find him?" The question sent chills down Eleanor's spine. I found him abandoned on Highway 2. He was in a pet carrier, left to die. That carrier was stolen from my truck 6 weeks ago, along with the animal inside it." Vincent's voice was calm, but there was an edge to it that made Eleanor step back. "I've been looking for him ever since." Bruno had risen at the sound of the stranger's voice, and Eleanor was struck by her companion's reaction. Instead of the friendly curiosity he showed most visitors, Bruno moved closer to Eleanor, positioning himself between her and Vincent. A low rumble, not quite a growl, but deeper than any sound she'd heard from him before, emanated from his chest. "Even if that were true," Eleanor said, finding her voice, "he was abandoned. I saved his life." Vincent smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Ma'am, that animal is worth more than your house. He's not a pet. He's an exotic animal that requires special permits, special care, and special handling. You've been breaking federal law for 6 weeks." The words hit Eleanor like a slap. Federal law? Exotic animal? She looked down at Bruno, who was now standing at her side, his head reaching nearly to her waist. In the fading afternoon light, his profile did look different from any dog she'd known. The shape of his ears, the breadth of his skull, the way he carried himself with an almost regal bearing. "I don't care about permits or laws," Eleanor heard herself saying. "He needed me, and I need him. We're family now." Vincent's expression hardened. "Family doesn't mean much when Fish and Wildlife shows up with handcuffs, Mrs. Walsh. You've got 48 hours to think about this. I'll be back with the proper paperwork, and you can either hand him over willingly, or I'll let the federal authorities handle it. Either way, that animal is coming with me." As Vincent drove away, Eleanor sank onto her porch steps, Bruno immediately moving to comfort her. For the first time since finding him, she allowed herself to really look at him, to see past her need and love to the reality of what he might actually be. And in that moment of honesty, she realized that everything she thought she knew about her life was about to change forever. Eleanor spent that night pacing her living room while Bruno watched her with those impossibly knowing eyes. She called Margaret, who came over immediately with a pot of coffee and the kind of practical wisdom that only comes from 7 decades of living through crises. "Show me his paperwork again," Margaret said, examining the documents Vincent had left behind. "Something doesn't feel right about this whole situation." Eleanor spread the papers across her kitchen table. Vincent claimed to run a licensed exotic animal facility called Wild Heritage Sanctuary in northern Idaho, specializing in animals that couldn't be released into the wild. His permits appeared legitimate. His references from other facilities looked official, but Margaret's frown deepened as she read. "Eleanor, honey, look at this date." Margaret pointed to the acquisition document. "This says Bruno was obtained 3 months ago, but you found him 6 weeks ago. The timeline doesn't match." Before Eleanor could respond, her phone rang. Dr. Martinez's name appeared on the caller ID, and Eleanor's heart began racing. The DNA results weren't supposed to be ready for another week. "Mrs. Walsh, I need you to come in immediately," Dr. Martinez said without preamble. "And please don't bring Bruno with you." The veterinary office felt different when Eleanor arrived alone 20 minutes later. Dr. Martinez looked like she hadn't slept, and there was a tension in her posture that made Eleanor's hands shake as she sat down. "The preliminary results are back, and Eleanor, I need you to understand the gravity of this situation." Dr. Martinez pulled out a thick folder. "Bruno isn't a dog. He's not even a dog hybrid. He's a North American black bear cub, specifically what appears to be a rare Kermode bear variant." The words hit Eleanor like a physical blow. She gripped the arms of her chair, trying to process information that seemed impossible. That's not possible. He acts like a dog. He sleeps in my room. He's never been aggressive." Hand-raised bear cubs often exhibit dog-like behaviors, especially if they're separated from their mothers very young. Dr. Martinez leaned forward. Eleanor, Bruno is approximately 4 months old now, which means he'll grow to be anywhere from 300 to 600 pounds. What you're seeing as puppy playfulness will become potentially dangerous adult behavior. Eleanor thought of Bruno's gentle nature, the way he carefully took treats from her fingers, how he seemed to understand when she was sad. But he's so sweet, so intelligent. He would never hurt me. I believe that, Dr. Martinez said softly. But intention doesn't matter to federal wildlife laws. Possessing a bear without proper permits is a felony. I'm legally obligated to report this to Fish and Wildlife Services within 24 hours. The drive home was a blur of tears and panic. Eleanor found Bruno waiting by the front door as if he sensed something was wrong. When she knelt down and wrapped her arms around him, all 60 pounds of him now, he pressed his massive head against her chest and made a soft, chuffing sound she'd learned meant contentment. "What are we going to do, sweet boy?" she whispered into his thick fur. "How did we get into this mess?" The answer came in the form of Margaret Chen marching across the street with a laptop under her arm and a determined expression on her face. "Eleanor, I've been doing research on this Vincent character, and you need to see what I found." Margaret set up her computer on Eleanor's kitchen table while Bruno settled at their feet, somehow understanding the seriousness of the adult conversation happening above him. "Wild Heritage Sanctuary does exist," Margaret said, pulling up a website. "But look at these reviews from former employees." She scrolled through page after page of complaints. Unsafe conditions, animals kept in inadequate enclosures, suspected illegal breeding programs. Eleanor read over Margaret's shoulder, her horror growing with each testimonial. One former veterinary technician wrote, "Vincent Castellano cares more about profit than animal welfare. The bears were kept in concrete enclosures barely large enough for them to stand up. When I reported conditions to authorities, I was fired." "There's more," Margaret continued. "I found newspaper articles from 3 years ago. Vincent lost his exotic animal license in Idaho after a federal investigation. His facility was shut down for violations of the Animal Welfare Act." Eleanor felt sick. But his paperwork looked official. Forgeries? I'd bet money on it. Margaret's voice was grim. "Eleanor, this man doesn't want Bruno back because he's concerned about the law. He wants him because a bear that size is worth a fortune on the black market." The implications crashed over Eleanor like a wave. Not only was she unknowingly harboring an illegal wild animal, but the man claiming to be Bruno's rightful owner was likely a criminal himself. And in 36 hours, if she didn't act, both she and Bruno would be at his mercy. That evening, Eleanor made a decision that would have seemed impossible just months ago. She called her son David in Atlanta. "Mom, slow down," David said when she'd finished explaining the situation. "You're telling me you've been living with a bear for 2 months?" "He's not just a bear, David. He's Bruno. He's family." Eleanor's voice broke. "I know it sounds crazy, but he saved my life in ways you can't understand." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. David had always been the most empathetic of her children, the one who inherited Harold's gentle heart along with his stubborn streak. "Mom, what do you need me to do?" Eleanor closed her eyes in relief. "I need a lawyer, the best wildlife attorney you can find. And David, I need to know my family supports me, even if this gets ugly." "You've got it, Mom." Both things. But not all of Eleanor's children were as supportive. When Michael called the next morning after hearing from David, his voice was sharp with panic and embarrassment. "Mom, this is insane. You could go to federal prison. You could lose the house, your savings, everything." Michael's tone carried the condescending patience he used with difficult clients. "I'm driving over there this weekend to help you sort this out." "There's nothing to sort out, Michael. Bruno stays with me." "Mom, it's a wild animal. It could kill you." Eleanor looked across the room where Bruno was carefully dismantling a puzzle toy she'd bought him, his large paws manipulating the pieces with surprising dexterity. "This wild animal brought me my morning slippers yesterday when my arthritis was acting up. He sits with me when I cry about your father. He's the reason I stopped taking antidepressants." The conversation ended badly, with Michael threatening to have her declared incompetent if she didn't see reason. Eleanor hung up, feeling more alone than ever, until Bruno padded over and rested his head on her lap, somehow understanding exactly what she needed. Margaret returned that afternoon with news that made Eleanor's blood run cold. "I called the number on Vincent's business card," she reported. "It's disconnected. The address he gave you? It's a vacant lot." Eleanor sank into her favorite chair, Bruno immediately positioning himself beside her. "So we don't even know who he really is or what he wants." "Oh, we know what he wants," Margaret said grimly. "A 4-month-old bear that's already trained to trust humans. Eleanor, do you have any idea what collectors pay for an animal like that?" Before Eleanor could answer, a car door slammed in her driveway. Through the front window, she could see Vincent Castellano approaching her front door, but this time he wasn't alone. 2 other men flanked him, both wearing official-looking badges. Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs as she answered the door, Bruno staying close to her side. Up close, the men's badges read Animal Control, but something about their bearing felt wrong. Too casual, too eager. "Mrs. Walsh," Vincent said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, "I told you I'd be back with the proper paperwork. These gentlemen are here to help facilitate the transfer." "I want to see official identification from all of you," Eleanor said, surprised by the strength in her own voice. "And I want to call the real authorities to verify your credentials." Vincent's smile faltered. "Ma'am, that's not necessary. We have the proper authorization to remove this animal for public safety reasons." Bruno, who had been calm until now, suddenly became alert. He moved in front of Eleanor, not aggressively, but with the unmistakable body language of protection. A low rumble emanated from his chest, deeper than any sound Eleanor had ever heard him make. "Tranquilizer gun," one of the fake animal control officers muttered to his companion, and Eleanor saw him reaching for something in his jacket. "Margaret, call 911!" Eleanor shouted to her neighbor, who was watching from her porch. What happened next would later be described in police reports as unprecedented. Bruno, still just a 4-month-old cub, somehow understood the threat to his human family. He didn't attack or become violent. Instead, he positioned himself squarely in the doorway and refused to move, his impressive size and unwavering stance making it clear that anyone who wanted to reach Eleanor would have to go through him first. The standoff lasted only minutes before real police sirens filled the air, but those minutes changed everything. As Vincent and his accomplices scattered, Eleanor realized that her choice was no longer about keeping a pet she loved. It was about protecting a family member who had just risked everything to protect her. The real battle was just beginning. The real police officers who responded to Margaret's 911 call were led by Sergeant Rebecca Stone, a 20-year veteran of wildlife enforcement who had seen every kind of exotic animal situation imaginable. But when she walked into Eleanor's living room and saw Bruno calmly sitting beside the elderly woman's chair, even her experienced composure wavered. "Mrs. Walsh, I need you to understand that what you have here is not just illegal, it's potentially catastrophic," Sergeant Stone said, maintaining a safe distance from Bruno. "That animal is going to weigh 400 pounds within the year. One swipe of his paw, even in play, could kill you." Eleanor's hand rested on Bruno's thick fur, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing. "Sergeant, I know this looks impossible to understand, but Bruno isn't violent. He's never shown the slightest aggression toward anyone." "Ma'am, with all due respect, that's what every exotic animal owner says right up until someone gets mauled." Stone pulled out her phone. I have to contact Fish and Wildlife Services. They'll want to remove him immediately to a federal facility. The next few hours became a blur of phone calls, legal consultations, and media attention that Eleanor never could have anticipated. David had been true to his word. Within 2 hours, he had connected Eleanor with Dr. Patricia Manning, one of the country's leading wildlife attorneys, who took Eleanor's case on an emergency basis. "Eleanor, I need you to listen carefully," Dr. Manning explained over the phone. "You have 3 options, none of them simple. Option 1. Surrender Bruno immediately to federal custody. He'll likely be placed in a zoo or wildlife facility where he'll never have human contact again. Option 2. We fight this in court, which could take months and will cost everything you have with no guarantee of success. Option 3. We try to find a legal loophole that allows you to keep him under special circumstances." Eleanor looked at Bruno, who was lying peacefully by the fireplace, seemingly oblivious to the chaos surrounding his existence. "What kind of special circumstances?" "Educational permits, wildlife rehabilitation licenses, sanctuary status. There are ways, but they require massive lifestyle changes and significant financial investment. You'd need to meet federal standards for wildlife care, which means proper enclosures, veterinary staff, educational programs. We're talking hundreds of thousands of dollars." The figure hit Eleanor like a physical blow. Her entire retirement savings wouldn't cover half of those requirements. But as she watched Bruno carefully playing with a rope toy, his movements already showing the power that would one day make him a formidable predator, she realized that money was just another obstacle to overcome. "How long do we have to figure this out?" 48 hours, maybe less. Fish and Wildlife is already mobilizing a removal team." Margaret had been listening to the conversation, and when Eleanor hung up, her neighbor's face was set with determination. "Eleanor, honey, do you remember when Harold had his heart surgery? How the whole neighborhood rallied to help with your medical bills?" Eleanor nodded, remembering the casseroles, the yard work, the envelope of cash that had appeared in her mailbox with no note attached. "Well, times have changed. These days, people help differently." Margaret opened her laptop again. "Have you heard of crowdfunding?" Within hours, Margaret had set up a GoFundMe page titled "Help Eleanor Save Bruno, a love story that transcends species." The description told Eleanor's story, simply but powerfully. A lonely widow who had found purpose and joy in caring for an abandoned animal, only to discover that love sometimes requires impossible sacrifices. Margaret's computer skills, honed by years of managing the neighborhood association's website, proved invaluable. She uploaded photos of Eleanor and Bruno together, Eleanor reading in her chair with Bruno's massive head resting on her lap, Bruno carefully taking treats from Eleanor's wrinkled hands, the two of them sitting on the front porch watching the sunset. But what happened next shocked everyone involved. The story began spreading on social media with a virality that seemed almost magical. Eleanor's daughter Jennifer, despite her initial skepticism, shared the post in her Portland mommy groups. David sent it to his network of Atlanta professionals. Even Michael, though still disapproving, forwarded it to his law school alumni association with a grudging note about his mother's situation. Dr. Sarah Martinez, who had been struggling with her legal obligation to report Bruno, made a decision that would define her career. Instead of simply notifying authorities, she began documenting Bruno's remarkable behavior and intelligence. Her veterinary notes became a detailed behavioral study that would later prove crucial to Eleanor's case. "Eleanor, you need to see this," Dr. Martinez said during what was supposed to be Bruno's final checkup before removal. "I've been testing Bruno's cognitive abilities, and the results are extraordinary. He's demonstrating problem-solving skills and emotional intelligence that rival some primates. He's not just bonded to you, he's actively protecting and caring for you." The veterinarian showed Eleanor video footage from her examination room. In one clip, Bruno noticed that Eleanor was shivering during a long consultation and carefully positioned himself to block a cold air vent. In another, when Eleanor dropped her keys, Bruno immediately picked them up and brought them to her, his massive jaws handling the small object with impossible delicacy. "This isn't normal bear behavior, Eleanor. What you've accomplished here, this level of interspecies bonding and communication, it's unprecedented." Meanwhile, Vincent Castellano hadn't given up. With his fake animal control operation exposed, he'd hired a legitimate attorney and was claiming ownership of Bruno through fraudulent documents that were becoming harder to disprove. His lawyer, Thomas Brennan, was known for representing exotic animal dealers and had a reputation for aggressive tactics. "My client has invested significant resources in this animal," Brennan argued during a heated phone conference with Eleanor's legal team. "Mrs. Walsh is essentially harboring stolen property worth upwards of $200,000. Dr. Manning fired back immediately. "Your client abandoned this animal on a public highway. Mrs. Walsh saved its life. Any ownership claims were forfeited through abandonment." But Vincent's most dangerous move came through the media. He began giving interviews to local news stations, presenting himself as a concerned wildlife expert, trying to rescue a dangerous animal from an irresponsible elderly woman. "This is a tragedy waiting to happen," he told Channel 4 News, standing in front of what appeared to be a professional wildlife facility. "Bears are not pets. This woman, however well-intentioned, is putting herself and her entire neighborhood at risk." The interview was expertly crafted to play on people's fears. Vincent showed stock footage of bear attacks, discussed the animal's potential for violence, and painted Eleanor as a confused old woman who didn't understand the danger she was in. Eleanor watched the broadcast from her living room, Bruno's head in her lap as always. The animal seemed to sense her distress and nuzzled her hand with surprising gentleness for something with such powerful jaws. "They don't know you like I do," Eleanor whispered. "They don't see how you bring me my slippers when my arthritis is bad, or how you sit by the door when you know I'm sad about Daddy." Margaret burst through the front door without knocking, her face flushed with excitement and her laptop in her hands. "Eleanor, you need to see this right now." The GoFundMe page had exploded overnight. What had started as a modest fundraising effort with a goal of $50,000 had already raised over $400,000 from donors around the world. The comment section read like a love letter to the human-animal bond. "My grandmother had a similar relationship with a rescued wolf hybrid," wrote one donor. "Animals know love when they see it, regardless of species." Another comment read, "I'm 73 years old and live alone. If I found an animal that brought me the kind of joy Eleanor has found with Bruno, I'd fight heaven and earth to keep him too." But it wasn't just individual donations that were pouring in. Wildlife sanctuaries from across the country were offering partnerships. The International Bear Association had reached out with potential solutions. Most surprisingly, the Confederated Tribes of the Colville Reservation had contacted Eleanor directly with a proposal that could change everything. Mrs. Walsh, Tribal Chairman Robert Joseph explained during a phone call that would alter the trajectory of Eleanor's fight, "Bears are sacred animals in our culture. What you've done, raising this cub with love and respect, honors both the animal and the ancient bond between humans and wildlife. We'd like to offer you something unprecedented." Eleanor's hands shook as she listened to the proposal. The tribe owned thousands of acres of pristine habitat just 2 hours from Spokane. They were willing to partner with Eleanor to create a legitimate educational sanctuary that would meet all federal requirements while allowing Bruno to remain with the woman who had raised him. "The only catch," Chairman Joseph continued, "is that you'd need to move to the reservation and dedicate your life to this work. This wouldn't be retirement. It would be a complete career change at age 68. Eleanor looked around her living room, filled with 40 years of memories she'd made with Harold. She thought about her quiet routine, her predictable days, the safe and comfortable life she'd built. Then she looked down at Bruno, who was watching her with those impossibly intelligent eyes, and she realized that comfort was just another word for existing without purpose. "When can we start?" Eleanor asked. The decision would set in motion a legal and logistical battle that would test everything Eleanor thought she knew about courage, sacrifice, and the lengths love could drive a person to go. But for the first time since Harold's death, Eleanor Walsh felt truly alive. Eleanor's world collapsed on a gray Thursday morning when federal agents arrived at her door with a court order that would separate her from Bruno forever. The legal document, stamped with official seals and signed by Judge Harrison, was cold and uncompromising. Due to public safety concerns and violation of federal wildlife protection laws, the animal must be surrendered to federal custody within 6 hours. Fish and Wildlife. Agent Carol Thompson stood on Eleanor's porch with 2 other agents, their expressions professionally sympathetic but immovable. "Mrs. Walsh, I understand this is difficult, but we have a containment vehicle ready. The animal will be transported to a federal facility in Colorado where he can receive appropriate care." Eleanor's legs nearly gave out beneath her. Colorado. A federal facility meant concrete walls, steel bars, and the kind of institutional care that would strip away everything that made Bruno the gentle, intelligent companion she'd come to love. Worse, it meant he would never understand why the person he trusted most had abandoned him. "Please," Eleanor whispered, her voice barely audible. "He's not just an animal to me. He's my family." Agent Thompson's expression softened slightly. "Ma'am, I have a grandmother your age. I understand what this animal means to you. But he's going to weigh 500 pounds within 2 years. What happens when he's playing and accidentally knocks you down? What happens when his natural instincts override his training?" Bruno, sensing the tension in the room, moved protectively to Eleanor's side. His massive frame, now over 80 pounds at just 5 months old, served as a stark reminder of Agent Thompson's warnings. But Eleanor saw only the concerned tilt of his head, the way he gently pressed against her trembling hands. The next few hours became a nightmare of legal maneuvering and emotional devastation. Eleanor's attorney, Dr. Manning, worked frantically on emergency appeals, while Eleanor sat helplessly watching agents set up equipment in her driveway. The large transport cage they'd brought looked like something designed for a dangerous criminal, not the gentle soul who had slept at the foot of her bed for months. Margaret Chen had called Eleanor's children, and Michael arrived first, his face grim with a mixture of concern and barely concealed relief. "Mom, this is for the best," he said, putting his arm around Eleanor's shaking shoulders. "You'll see. In a few weeks you'll realize how dangerous this situation had become." Eleanor jerked away from her son's embrace. "Don't you dare tell me this is for the best." "Would you say that if they were taking away one of your children?" "Mom, it's not a child, it's a wild animal that could kill you." The argument that followed was vicious and heartbreaking, with 40 years of mother-son relationships fracturing over fundamental disagreements about love, safety, and the right to choose one's own risks. Eleanor's other children arrived during the confrontation: Jennifer from Portland, her face red from crying, and David from Atlanta, who had flown in overnight to be with his mother during what he knew would be the worst day of her life. "I can't believe I'm losing him," Eleanor sobbed against David's chest. "He saved my life, and now they're taking him away like he's some kind of monster." Dr. Martinez arrived with Bruno's medical records and a statement she'd prepared documenting his remarkable intelligence and gentle nature. But even her professional testimony couldn't overcome the legal reality. Eleanor Walsh, a 68-year-old retired nurse, had been keeping a federally protected wild animal without permits, and the law was absolute. The actual removal was more traumatic than anyone had anticipated. Bruno, who had never been separated from Eleanor for more than a few hours, seemed to understand that something terrible was happening. When the agents approached with the tranquilizer gun, a precaution they insisted was necessary, Bruno didn't become aggressive. Instead, he positioned himself between Eleanor and the strangers, whimpering in a way that sounded heartbreakingly like crying. "Please don't sedate him," Eleanor begged. "He won't fight you. He just doesn't understand what's happening." Agent Thompson made a decision that would haunt her for years afterward. "Mrs. Walsh, if you can get him into the transport cage voluntarily, we won't use the tranquilizer. But you have to convince him to go willingly." Eleanor knelt beside Bruno, her hands trembling as she held his massive face. At 5 months old, he was already too large for her to lift, but his eyes still held the trust and innocence of the puppy she'd rescued from Highway 2. "Bruno, baby, you have to go with these people," Eleanor whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I know you don't understand, but they're going to take you somewhere safe. And maybe someday we'll see each other again." Bruno tilted his head, clearly trying to process words and emotions beyond his comprehension. When Eleanor stood and walked toward the transport cage, he followed without hesitation, his trust in her absolute even in the face of circumstances that terrified him. Watching Bruno walk into that cage was the moment Eleanor's heart truly broke. He turned around to look at her one last time, his expression so human-like in its confusion and sadness that several of the federal agents had to look away. Eleanor pressed her face against the metal bars and whispered promises she wasn't sure she could keep. "I'll find a way to see you again. I promise, sweet boy. Mommy's going to figure this out." The transport vehicle pulled away at 3:47 p.m. on a Thursday afternoon, taking with it the only source of joy Eleanor had found since Harold's death. She collapsed on her front porch, her sobs so deep and racking that Margaret was genuinely worried about her friend's physical health, but the worst was yet to come. That evening, Vincent Castellano appeared on the local news again, this time with footage of Bruno being loaded into the federal transport. His comments were calculated to inflict maximum emotional damage. "This is what happens when people think emotion can override the law," Vincent told the reporter. "That bear is going to a facility where trained professionals can care for it properly. Mrs. Walsh created a dangerous situation that could have ended in tragedy." Eleanor watched the broadcast from her bedroom, wrapped in the blanket that still smelled like Bruno's fur. The interviewer asked Vincent about his own claims to ownership, and his response revealed a cruelty that stunned even Eleanor's family. "I'm dropping my ownership claims," Vincent announced with a cold smile. "Let the federal government deal with this animal. Mrs. Walsh's attachment to it was unnatural anyway. Sometimes the kindest thing is to let people face reality." The implications hit Eleanor like a sledgehammer. Vincent was abandoning his ownership claims, which meant Bruno would remain in federal custody indefinitely. There would be no private sanctuary, no possibility of visiting rights, no hope of any kind of relationship continuing. Bruno would live the rest of his life as a number in a government facility, never understanding why the person he trusted most had disappeared from his world. Eleanor's breakdown that night was so severe that Margaret called Dr. Martinez, worried that her friend might be having a heart attack. The veterinarian arrived to find Eleanor hyperventilating, her blood pressure dangerously elevated, and her grief so profound that she couldn't speak coherently. "Eleanor, you need to listen to me," Dr. Martinez said, checking her pulse and vital signs. "Bruno is going to be cared for. The federal facility in Colorado has an excellent reputation. He'll have proper nutrition, veterinary care, and space to grow." "But he won't have love," Eleanor whispered. "He won't understand why I'm gone. He's just a baby, and he'll think I abandoned him." David stayed with his mother that night, holding her as she cried herself into exhaustion. He had flown across the country expecting to help his mother recover from an unfortunate situation, but witnessing her grief had opened his eyes to something he hadn't understood before. Bruno hadn't just been a pet to Eleanor. He had been her salvation from a depression that might have killed her. "Mom," David said softly, as Eleanor finally began to drift toward sleep, "tell me what you need me to do. Not what's practical or legal or safe. Tell me what you need." Eleanor's answer came without hesitation, even through her exhaustion. "I need my baby back." It was a need that would drive Eleanor Walsh to make choices she never could have imagined and to discover reserves of strength she didn't know she possessed. The revelation that would change everything came from the most unexpected source: Vincent Castellano's own daughter. 3 days after Bruno's removal, while Eleanor lay in bed unable to eat or sleep, a young woman named Emma Castellano appeared at her front door with tears streaming down her face and a manila folder clutched in her shaking hands. "Mrs. Walsh, my name is Emma, and my father is Vincent Castellano," the 25-year-old said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I need to tell you the truth about what he's done, not just to you, but to dozens of other families." Eleanor, hollow-eyed and wearing the same clothes she'd had on for 2 days, invited Emma inside. Margaret, who had been staying with Eleanor since Bruno's removal, made coffee while Emma spread documents across the kitchen table with trembling fingers. "My father wasn't always like this," Emma began, her voice thick with shame and grief. "Before my little sister died, he ran a legitimate wildlife sanctuary. He genuinely loved animals, especially bears. But when Emily was killed in that car accident 3 years ago, something broke inside him." Eleanor felt a flicker of empathy despite her own agony. "I'm sorry for your loss." Emma's laugh was bitter. "Don't be sorry for him. Be angry. Because after Emily died, Dad became obsessed with the idea that love for animals was weakness, that emotional attachment made people vulnerable. He started targeting people like you, lonely, elderly people who had found comfort in caring for animals." The documents Emma produced painted a horrifying picture of systematic emotional abuse. Vincent had been identifying people who had formed deep bonds with exotic animals, then using legal intimidation and psychological manipulation to separate them from their companions. The animals were then sold to private collectors for enormous profits. Mrs. Patterson in Boise, Mrs. Chen in Portland, Mr. Rodriguez in Denver. Dad has destroyed at least 20 families over the past 2 years, Emma continued, her voice growing stronger with each revelation. He specifically targets older people who are isolated because they're less likely to have the resources to fight back legally. Margaret gasped as she read over Eleanor's shoulder. "Eleanor, look at this. Mrs. Patterson's story is almost identical to yours. She found an abandoned wolf hybrid, raised it for months, and Vincent used the same tactics to have it removed." But Emma's most devastating revelation was still to come. The animals Dad claims to place in appropriate facilities aren't going to sanctuaries or zoos. They're being sold to private collectors who want exotic pets with human imprinting. Mrs. Walsh, your Bruno isn't in federal custody at all. He's probably already been sold to someone who sees him as a status symbol. Eleanor felt the room spinning around her. "What do you mean he's not in federal custody? The agents who came to your house weren't federal agents. Dad hired actors with fake badges and uniforms. The transport vehicle was a rental truck with government decals he had made at a print shop." Emma's tears began flowing again. "Bruno was taken to a private facility in Nevada where Dad has contacts who specialize in placing illegally obtained animals with wealthy collectors." The betrayal was so complete, so calculated in its cruelty, that Eleanor couldn't process it all at once. Everything she'd believed about Bruno's fate, every assumption about his safety and care, had been an elaborate lie designed to maximize her suffering while profit was extracted from her love. Margaret was already reaching for her phone. "We need to call the real authorities immediately. This is kidnapping, fraud, and animal trafficking." But Emma shook her head frantically. "That's exactly what Dad is counting on. He's been setting up evidence to make it look like Mrs. Walsh was the one operating illegally. If the real FBI gets involved now, they'll arrest her for possession of an illegal exotic animal, and she'll never see Bruno again." Eleanor felt a rage building inside her, unlike anything she'd ever experienced. This man had not only stolen the creature she loved most in the world, but he had manipulated her grief and turned her own legal system against her. The cruelty was so profound it took her breath away. "Why are you telling me this?" Eleanor asked Emma. "Why betray your own father?" Emma's answer came through sobs that shook her entire body. "Because I watched what losing Emily did to him, and I won't watch him destroy other people's love to make himself feel better about his loss. What you had with Bruno, that pure, healing love, that's what Dad lost when Emily died. Instead of finding it again, he's trying to make sure no one else can have it either." The conversation was interrupted by David bursting through the front door, his face flushed with excitement and his phone pressed to his ear. "Mom, you need to hear this. I've been working with Dr. Manning on tracking down Vincent's real background, and we've found something incredible." David's research had uncovered something that Vincent's own daughter didn't know. Vincent Castellano was wanted by federal authorities for real crimes. Not only had he been operating an illegal animal trafficking ring, but he'd been using fraudulent documentation to steal animals from legitimate owners and sell them to private collectors. "Mom, Vincent made one crucial mistake," David explained, his voice quickening with excitement. "When he filed those fake ownership papers for Bruno, he created a federal paper trail. The FBI has been tracking him for months in connection with similar cases across 3 states. Dr. Manning's voice crackled through David's phone on speaker. "Eleanor, I've been in contact with Special Agent Sarah Kim from the FBI's Wildlife Crime Unit. They've been building a case against Vincent for over a year, but they needed someone willing to cooperate as a witness. You could be the key to bringing down his entire operation." Eleanor felt hope beginning to stir in her chest for the first time in days. "What does that mean for Bruno?" "It means that if we can prove Bruno was obtained illegally by Vincent and stolen from you through fraudulent means, you might have grounds to get him back. But Eleanor, you need to understand the risks. Cooperating with this investigation means admitting that you've been harboring an illegal exotic animal, which could still result in criminal charges." Eleanor looked around her kitchen at the faces of people who had rallied to support her. Margaret, who had become more like a sister than a neighbor. David, who had dropped everything to fly across the country and fight for her. Emma, who was risking her relationship with her father to expose his crimes. And Dr. Manning, who was working around the clock to find legal solutions. "I don't care about the risks to me," Eleanor said firmly. "Bruno is out there somewhere, probably scared and confused, wondering why I abandoned him. I'll do whatever it takes to get him back." The plan they devised was audacious and dangerous. Emma would return to her father and act as an informant, gathering evidence of his trafficking operation while maintaining the pretense of loyalty. Meanwhile, Eleanor would work with federal agents to document her relationship with Bruno and prove that Vincent's claims of ownership were fraudulent. But the most shocking revelation was yet to come. Emma hesitated before sharing the final piece of information she'd brought. "Mrs. Walsh, there's something else you need to know about Bruno specifically. My father didn't find him abandoned on Highway 2. Bruno's mother was one of the bears at Dad's old sanctuary, before it was shut down. When the federal authorities raided the facility, they found her dead from neglect. But Bruno had been hidden away." Eleanor felt her knees go weak. "Are you saying Bruno was born in captivity?" "More than that," Emma continued. Bruno was born to a bear that Dad had illegally bred with a male from a different subspecies. Bruno isn't just any bear. He's genetically unique. That's why he's so intelligent, why he bonded with you so completely. Dad has been planning to sell him to collectors who pay premium prices for genetically unusual animals. The implications crashed over Eleanor like a wave. Bruno hadn't just been abandoned by chance. He had been specifically targeted by Vincent from the moment of his birth. Everything about their meeting, their bond, even Vincent's eventual discovery of Eleanor's situation had been orchestrated by a man who saw love as a commodity to be exploited. But Eleanor's grief was transforming into something more powerful than Vincent had anticipated. The lonely, depressed widow who had found an abandoned animal on the highway was gone. In her place stood a woman who had discovered that love was worth fighting for, no matter the cost, and who was about to wage a war against a system that treated compassion as a crime and families as property to be bought and sold. "Emma," Eleanor said, her voice steady for the first time in days, "tell me exactly how to destroy your father's operation and get my son back." 6 months after the FBI raid that brought down Vincent Castellano's trafficking operation, Eleanor Walsh stood in the early morning sunshine of her new life, watching Bruno, now a magnificent 200-pound adolescent bear, carefully navigate the obstacle course she'd built for him in the 40-acre sanctuary that had become their shared home. The Colville Reservation's partnership with Eleanor had exceeded everyone's expectations. What had started as a desperate attempt to create a legal framework for keeping Bruno had blossomed into the Pacific Northwest's most innovative wildlife education center. Harold's Haven, named for Eleanor's late husband, now housed 12 rescued bears and employed 15 full-time staff members. But Bruno remained its heart and Eleanor's constant companion. "Good morning, handsome boy," Eleanor called softly, as Bruno approached the fence where she stood with his breakfast, a carefully prepared mixture of fruits, vegetables, and fish that met all his nutritional needs. At nearly a year old, Bruno had retained all the gentleness and intelligence that had first captured Eleanor's heart, but now possessed the dignity and grace of his wild heritage. Dr. Martinez, who had become the sanctuary's head veterinarian, joined Eleanor at the fence with Bruno's morning health check clipboard. "His weight is perfect, his coat is glossy, and his cognitive responses are still off the charts," she reported with a smile. "Eleanor, what you've accomplished with him is nothing short of miraculous." The transformation in Eleanor herself was equally remarkable. The depressed, isolated widow who had found Bruno on Highway 2 had evolved into a confident wildlife educator whose presentations attracted visitors from around the world. At 69, she had more energy and purpose than she'd possessed in decades, her days filled with the meaningful work of caring for animals that others had given up on. "Mrs. Walsh, we're ready for the morning tour group," called David, who had permanently relocated from Atlanta to help run the sanctuary. Her youngest son had discovered a passion for wildlife conservation he never knew he possessed, and seeing him work alongside the bears had healed something in Eleanor's heart that she hadn't realized was broken. The tour group that morning included 30 school children from Spokane, their faces bright with excitement as Eleanor led them to Bruno's enclosure. This was Eleanor's favorite part of each day, watching young minds open to the possibilities of cross-species communication and love. "Now, children, I want you to meet my son Bruno," Eleanor began, using the term that had become natural over the months they'd been together. "Bruno was abandoned when he was just a baby, smaller than many of your pet dogs, but with love, patience, and proper care, he's grown into the magnificent animal you see today." Bruno, as if understanding his cue, approached the educational fence and sat politely while Eleanor demonstrated some of the behaviors he'd learned. He could distinguish between different colored objects, follow complex verbal commands, and even demonstrate what appeared to be genuine empathy when Eleanor or other staff members seemed upset. The most important thing to understand, Eleanor continued, her voice carrying the authority of hard-won experience, is that Bruno isn't a pet. He's a wild animal who deserves respect and appropriate care. What makes our relationship special isn't that I've made him into something he's not, but that I've learned to love him for exactly what he is. One small girl raised her hand tentatively. Mrs. Walsh, does Bruno remember when he was scared and alone? Eleanor felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came whenever she thought about those dark months when Bruno had been taken from her. I think he does remember, sweetheart. But more importantly, he knows that he's safe and loved now. Sometimes the most beautiful relationships come from two beings who needed each other at exactly the right moment. After the tour, Eleanor sat on the wooden bench Harold had built overlooking the main enclosure, Bruno resting peacefully in the grass nearby. Margaret Chen, now a regular volunteer at the sanctuary, joined her with 2 cups of coffee and the latest update from the outside world. Vincent's sentencing is next week, Margaret reported. Emma testified that he'll likely get 15 years in federal prison for the trafficking operation. 23 families got their animals back or received compensation for animals that couldn't be recovered. Eleanor nodded, feeling a complex mixture of satisfaction and sadness. Vincent's downfall had been swift once the FBI had enough evidence to move forward. The raid on his Nevada facility had uncovered a horror show of illegally obtained animals kept in deplorable conditions, generating national outrage and leading to the strongest federal penalties for wildlife trafficking in decades. "What about Emma?" Eleanor asked. Emma Castellano had risked everything to expose her father's crimes, and Eleanor felt a maternal concern for the young woman who had made Bruno's rescue possible. "She's doing well. Started veterinary school at Washington State University and volunteers here every weekend. I think she's found her own path to healing." Margaret smiled. "She told me yesterday that watching you and Bruno together taught her that love doesn't make you weak, it makes you fierce." The afternoon brought Eleanor's favorite visitor, her granddaughter Sophie, Jennifer's 8-year-old daughter, who had become one of Bruno's most devoted friends. Under carefully supervised conditions, Sophie was learning to interact with Bruno in ways that respected both his wild nature and their growing bond. "Grandma Eleanor, can I show Bruno the new book I'm reading?" Sophie asked, settling onto the grass near the fence with her latest adventure story. Eleanor watched with wonder as her granddaughter read aloud to the massive bear, who listened with apparent interest, occasionally making soft chuffing sounds that seemed to encourage her to continue. The sight never failed to move Eleanor to tears. This child, who had barely known her grandmother before Bruno's arrival, was now a weekly presence in Eleanor's life. Their relationship deepened by their shared love for an extraordinary animal. As the sun began to set over the Cascade Mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, Eleanor found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The lonely widow who had contemplated whether life was worth living had discovered not just purpose, but a kind of happiness she hadn't known was possible. Bruno approached the fence where Eleanor stood, now tall enough that his head reached nearly to her shoulder. She scratched behind his ears in the spot that never failed to make him close his eyes in contentment, and felt the familiar surge of love and gratitude that defined her days now. "You saved my life, you know," she whispered to him, the words she'd spoken countless times but never tired of saying. Not just from loneliness, but from giving up on joy entirely. Dr. Martinez joined Eleanor for the evening medical check, a routine they'd maintained every day since Bruno's return. His vital signs are perfect, his behavior is stable, and his bond with you continues to be the strongest human-animal relationship I've ever documented," she reported. "Eleanor, you've proven something that will change how we think about wildlife rehabilitation forever." As Eleanor locked up the education center and prepared for another peaceful evening in the small house she'd built at the edge of Bruno's territory, she received a phone call that brought her story full circle. A woman in Oregon had found an abandoned wolf puppy and, inspired by Eleanor's story, was seeking advice on creating a legal sanctuary situation. "The most important thing to understand," Eleanor found herself saying, "is that love isn't enough by itself. You need knowledge, resources, legal protections, and the willingness to change your entire life for this animal. But if you have all of those things, and if this animal truly needs you, then the love will carry you through everything else." After hanging up, Eleanor sat on her porch as she did every evening, Bruno lying peacefully in the grass nearby, both of them watching the stars emerge over their shared home. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new animals in need, new opportunities to prove that the bond between humans and wildlife could be both powerful and responsible. At 70 years old, Eleanor Walsh had found her true calling in the most unexpected way possible. She had learned that family doesn't always look like what you expect, that purpose can emerge from the deepest grief, and that sometimes the most meaningful life begins just when you think your story is ending. In the distance, Bruno's gentle rumbling, the sound he made when completely content, drifted across the sanctuary grounds, a lullaby that carried Eleanor into dreams of tomorrow's possibilities. At 68, Eleanor Walsh discovered something that changed everything. It's never too late to find your purpose, and sometimes the family you need finds you when you least expect it. When she rescued what she thought was an abandoned puppy, Eleanor was drowning in loneliness after losing her husband, Harold. She spent her days watching morning shows alone, setting 2 plates out of habit, wondering if anyone would notice when she was gone. But Bruno, who turned out to be a bear cub, didn't just need Eleanor's care. He gave her a reason to wake up excited every morning. Their bond challenged laws, defied expectations, and ultimately transformed Eleanor from a forgotten widow into a passionate wildlife advocate who built a sanctuary that saves lives every day. Eleanor's story proves that love doesn't have an expiration date, and that the courage to protect what matters most can emerge at any age. She traded her quiet retirement for adventure, purpose, and the kind of joy she thought was behind her forever. Sometimes the most beautiful chapter of your life begins when you think the book is ending. What would you risk everything to protect? Have you ever found unexpected purpose during your most difficult season? Share your story in the comments below.